I think what we've learned from Biden when it comes to Palestine is there is no difference between his stance and Trump's stance, and to the point where, and we could talk about it right now. AIPAC is having their annual meeting, I guess, and Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, spoke there at AIPAC. And AIPAC has since been revealed in the last couple of years to firmly stand with insurrectionist Republicans who did not want Joe Biden to be president. And yet now you have Blinken speaking. So anyway, just thoughts on that and sort of why and how Biden is carrying the Trump legacy when it comes to Israel-Palestine along with their administration.
Yeah. I mean, we knew this before, right? Before this AIPAC conference, before Biden came into power, the writing was on the wall that it wasn't just Biden, but it was that the Democratic National Committee was consistent on the Trump policy. So, for example, one of the most controversial things that happened during the Trump administration was the recognition of Israel's declared sovereignty over Jerusalem, right? So many of the headlines ran that this was in contravention of 5 decades of U.S. policy on the question of Jerusalem since the 1967 war. Aptly, this week, today is the anniversary of the start of that war. And yet the DNC had said very clearly that none of their presidential candidates would actually move the U.S. embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. And so the writing was on the wall. We also know that the Biden administration was in line with the Trump administration on almost every other policy, including Israel's declared sovereignty over the Syrian Golan Heights, including the embassy, where the Abraham Accords. The only thing that the Biden administration did different was to reinstate some $364 million of humanitarian aid to the United Nations Relief Works Agency, or basically for education and healthcare for Palestinian refugees. We knew that before he came into office. Still, many of us, including myself, supported Biden's presidential bid, not because of the hope that he would change on the question of Palestine, because unlike most other issues, there's almost no daylight between the mainstream Democratic establishment and the Republican establishment. We see the wedge really, really clearly between the progressive Dems, right? Yes. And that's why there's an insurrection within the Democratic Party, and it can explain why Blinken is at AIPAC, even as AIPAC is supporting the insurrectionists, right? Because they're more closely aligned than actually the progressive Dems and the mainstream Democrats. I supported him nonetheless because I thought that there would be more room for organizing, right? That the punishment would be less severe because Trump had such an authoritarian approach, and beyond just what he was signaling in the spaces that he was shrinking in the United States, the signals to the rest of the world that gave permission for other authoritarians and other, fascists to come into office, right? So that if we can at least get Trump out of office, it would stem a wave globally.
But Trump is openly
more or less the same.
Yeah, Trump openly and the right openly covets becoming Israel, they love the security state, the apartheid state that is Israel. So I don't think the Democrats fawn or pine for that. But again, how much do they stop it, combat it? And, Biden hasn't had a settlement named after him yet, unlike Trump. That was my favorite news out of the Trump years when it came to the region. But I guess I want to talk about the 67 war and the anniversary, this week. And also at the same time, Anthony Blinken, saying and uttering the words the two-state solution, consistently, even going back to that at this late date in the year 2023. Why, what should we know about the 67 war and what it meant and what it means for, some kind of resolution in the future, two-state, and what it means specifically for the fallacy, the idea of that two-state solution?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this in two parts, right? So the 67 war and the one part and the legacies that it created was a false partition between Israel's undeclared borders. Israel hasn't declared its borders, specifically because it's a settler colonial entity and it continues to expand its colonial takings by taking Palestinian lands and removing Palestinians in a settler colonial project. So in 1967, what we have established is a new narrative that normalizes Israel's establishment in 1948 and normalizes or attempts to normalize the mass removal and forced exile of the majority of Palestinians. Some 750,000 Palestinians out of a million natives become exiled from their homeland. And so 1967 marks a moment when that becomes normalized, because now the new attention is given to the Arab lands that Israel has occupied, specifically the Egyptian Sinai, the Syrian Golan Heights, the West Bank, including Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip. So thereafter, we have the framework move from a framework of refugees, of antagonism between Arab states and Israel, now to a Middle East peace process that's ushered by the United States and the Soviet Union following the war. And what we know, very commonly as 242 and 338, the Security Council resolutions that basically say that Israel has to withdraw from the territories that it occupied in war. Now,
this is the occupation as we talk about it. Like, I mean, this is sort of, there's much more, but when you say occupation, it is this land grab.
This land grab, not the land grab in 1948, right? Mm-hmm. Which is 78% of historical Palestine. That becomes normalized. People are no longer, even in the language of the law, that becomes normalized. Yep. So since 67, the issue has been just the territories that Israel occupied. But Israel never intended to withdraw from those territories. It intended to stay, and it has stayed. It's declared its sovereignty over the Golan Heights. It's basically declared that Area C in the West Bank, which is an invention of the peace process, is under de facto annexation, and it's declared sovereignty over East Jerusalem. It has withdrawn from the Egyptian Sinai, and that's why it says it's completed its obligations under, Resolution 242, and it's withdrawn its soldiers and its settlements from the Gaza Strip, but it maintains the occupation over Gaza as well. So when Blinken now says we want the two-state solution and we support the two-state solution, basically saying that they want to maintain an ongoing status quo of oppression, because there is a de facto one-state reality whereby Israel is the single power between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan. And actually, there are settlers that live by Palestinians in the West Bank, that there's proximity everywhere. The only distinction is the vast distance between them in terms of legal status, in terms of rights, and the denial, both the denial of Palestinian sovereignty, they can't have their own state, as well as the fact that they will also not become citizens of the state of Israel, because that would undermine a Jewish demographic majority. I mean, but just think of how racist that is. No, Israel has never allowed Palestinians to actually become part of the country. Not that that's what Palestinians are fighting for, right? We're a native people fighting for our self-determination, but have never allowed them to become part of the country because they think that the undermining of a Jewish demographic majority would destroy Israel. And so when you said earlier, Francesca, you were referring to, and by the way, congratulations on so much that you've recently celebrated. You. But when you said earlier that, the U.S., celebrates Israel as a model, white supremacists celebrate it as a model, right? Yep. Richard Spencer says that this is the future of European sovereignty, what Israel is doing, right? What Israel is doing is exporting exactly what you were saying, a military state, a carceral state, a regime of surveillance, of constant oppression, right? Of a religious fascism that others will follow suit. And many others have, as we've seen, for example, in Hungary, as you mentioned, Nalini, but as well as in India, as well as in Brazil, although there's pushback against that, thankfully, because of the ouster of Bolsonaro.
Yeah. No, I think that's an incredible summary. And it also, so in a sense, when he says two-state it means nothing. And it hasn't, I mean, I think everyone needs to understand, there is no status quo when it comes to Israel, because again, it has not defined its borders. Settlers and settler violence and the seizing of land happens constantly, even though all we're sort of all they're kind of futzing with is hey, could you stop for 3 months? And they're yeah, we were tired anyway. No more settlements for this amount of time. And then the US hails that as a win, even though it's, again, the ground is completely shifted. And we all feel like we're taking crazy pills.
Well, and also just to keep in mind, right, that number one, the reason that the U.S. is so supportive of the two-state solution is to preserve, Zionist settler sovereignty, so that you can preserve this distinction, this partition of population, so that you don't disrupt the Jewish demographic majority. So it's never about Palestinians to begin with. And even if it was applied, it would deny Palestinians the right of return. So even in its most just application, it's not a good solution. But putting that aside, the truth is that the peace process that was ushered in 1991 was dead upon delivery. There was no promise in the Oslo peace process that the U.S. moderated, right, that brokered and is now the sole broker. There's no mention of a state. There's no promise of a state. There will never be a Palestinian state. Over and over, Israeli presidents and leaders have told us there will never be a Palestinian state. So when they say a two-state solution, what they're really referring to is reservations. They created an autonomy plan for Palestinians to maintain their own, limited sovereignty, derivative sovereignty in certain areas, some 6% of the entire territory in Area A, and that's it. So it's like Black homelands in South Africa that were rejected as racist and supremacist projects, but here in this context are hailed as a pathway to the future, which is so ironic, especially now, right? As somebody who's been working on this, and you know this, Francesca, for decades now.
Yes.
When I saw this fascist, right government come into office, quite literally the most fascist that Israel has ever seen, which is saying a lot for Israel, right?
Yeah.
I kind of had this moment where I was like, finally, everybody's going to understand how racist this country is, right? And how racist this regime is, who say, let's wipe out Palestinian cities, who arm settlers to kill with impunity, who change the law so that nobody's held to account, right? Who snipe journalists in full daylight, right? I just had this moment where I was like, now surely Americans will understand. And yet it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It's like living in the Twilight Zone, where you have Blinken going to AIPAC, right, in the midst of, Israelis actually led the most robust BDS campaign against Israel because they opposed this government, not on behalf of Palestinians, of course. They could care less and were invisible to them. But even in that context, we still have the same rhetoric repeating itself. And so there is a commitment to a racist, supremacist, colonial project. The U.S. is committed to it, regardless of what the outcome is. And really, the sad part is where progressives are on this issue, because this should actually push us all to a point of consolidating our position in rejecting any kind of framework that wants to say, but there is a way for Israel to be a liberal democracy and for two states to exist. That's been dead, and we should completely oppose that position.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
As you do. I'm not saying that this is an issue here.
No,
I'm just,
of course. And I wanted to talk about specifically this upheaval inside of Israel, inside of, in opposition to the judicial grab and sort of the changing of I guess it's a concentration in terms of separation of powers there, that has seen massive protests, even to the point where, you're seeing protests in New York on Israel Day, and in Israel on Flag Day, and all these places where usually it's Palestinians and allies and people who, like us, who are out there. And you're like, oh, now, what do you make of this movement in terms of, and how does it feel? I can only imagine the sting of don't you understand that Palestinians and those also living inside of Israel, this is the democracy that they have been fighting for decades?
Well, yeah, you know what? It just feels like epic gaslighting, right? It's massive protests. I just saw a headline. It's an old headline, but it was a headline that was, the U.S. has a lot to learn from Israel about democracy. It's well, I guess from one white settler colony to
next
a Zionist settler colony, perhaps, maybe, if that's what you mean. But the idea that there would be these massive protests, which tells you that there is a willingness to protest, there is a willingness to mass action, but not even to end the occupation, let alone to end a supremacist, regime that's intact, that Israeli human rights organizations have said is tantamount to apartheid. is Jewish supremacy, right? Is massive gaslighting, because what they want is a return to the status quo. What they're concerned with, and what this recent government brought in, was a coalition of religious parties that were enabled, Netanyahu to have yet another political life. That's all that it is.
They can rise from the dead, for all those who are saying Trump won't be reelected. Look at Netanyahu.
Yes, that's another lesson for us to learn, that there is a way. So, but they're homophobic. They're quite violent. They want to employ, they want religious texts to be part of their governing structure. They don't want Israel just to be, people who happen to be Jews, right? But they actually want it to be Jewish in character. They want to draw on, religious texts in order to govern. That's where the protest is coming from, right? Or against. But none of them are actually concerned with the fact that their country, right, oversees and controls the lives of some 6 million Palestinians who live in complete subjugation, subject to a debilitating siege and systematic warfare in the Gaza Strip in an open-air prison, subject to second-class citizenship in Israel, where I just got back from Palestine yesterday. And, one of my friends who's from Nazareth, and I was like, I kind of was hoping that Palestinians on the inside would be the source of new movement. And she said, really, Noura? Our whole goal is to leave the house and come back that day without getting attacked or killed. Yeah. Right? Or in the West Bank, where literally yesterday, a 2-year-old boy was killed, right? When he and his father were trying to get in their car. So these are the conditions that Palestinians live under. That's not what the protests are about. The protests are about whether or not you have secular texts or religious texts, and what kind of governance and a separation of powers that governs Israelis, Jewish Israelis. Well,
I appreciate you breaking that down, because I also don't know the ins and outs of it. So I think it's important. But I also, there's part of me that's like, is that a step? You know what I mean? Talking about, Nalini's we're talking about coalition building, and we know there are, resistors, there are folks who are working against the occupation who are Israeli. Could this be a step? You just said it. They have the fire and the passion to protest. Is that ultimately maybe in the service of what will end the occupation? Is sort of cracking open, and kind of the fallacy that this is the only democracy in the Middle East. Oops, I guess it's incredibly authoritarian and religious based now, and only, you know what I mean? That might actually give way to something broader.
I'm with you, Annalini, on strategic opportunity, right?
Right.
That this is about, we have to, take whatever opportunity we can, take this, controversy that they have, widen the controversy. I'm with any kind of opportunity in order to expand the discussion, right? Disruption, controversy creates an opportunity. But I'll tell you this much from my experience in all of the coverage, and there was such robust coverage of these protests.
Yes, there was
NPR, a lot. To the New York Times, to the Washington Post, right? Across the board, CNN, constant coverage, right? Not once did they invite a Palestinian analyst to discuss the elephant in the room. Not once. I had journalists call me off record to ask about it, but it never ran in the stories. It never ran in the stories. They were creating a story around Israel and their Israeli fight for democracy that left out Palestinians deliberately because it was too risky. On the ground, there is the tiny camp of left-wing Israelis who will show up with their, there is no democracy under occupation. There are my colleagues who publish, Gideon Levy and Haaretz, and others, Gershon Shafir, who have published, essays that say there is no democracy under apartheid, right? But that has not become widespread. That has not caught on. They have not invited Palestinians to lead, for example.
Sure.
They have not created new coalitions. So whatever opportunities we have, the deep-rooted racism, right? It's really the normalization of racism against Palestinians that has made this opportunity apparent, but not available to us to take advantage of.
Nalini, did you want to jump in at all? I think
it's I definitely resonate with the moment of gaslighting. you know, when obviously not with the same extremes, but when Trump was elected, right, there were a bunch of people who were out in the millions of people who were out in the streets. Meanwhile, we had been out during Occupy Wall Street. We had been out, you know, blah, blah. I can insert every movement I've been a part of, but we would be here too long. And so, you know, you had that moment, and there is still like, I think particularly like class is something that we still aren't talking about in the United States. And we refuse to, because a lot of the people who've been leading the resistance have been mostly middle-class white women who do not have that much to lose, even though people are dying through the conditions that they have, or being literally pushed out of their homes en masse, where we have tent cities growing in all of these different places. Obviously is not the same thing as the occupation in Israel and Palestine, but I can definitely resonate in terms of that. And I was hoping to see, because I know some of the leftists who are there who've done, I know that there's still the small crew that have done a lot of stuff for Israelis, but it is really hard. It's really saddened to hear that people are not taking the opportunity to blow the lid off of everything, which is the entire state being a state that decides to, that can only survive by oppressing.
But it is interesting. Right. Sorry. I do think it's interesting that there's a limit, because I feel like the Israeli government is so far right. Like it's so, if you imagine how far right you think this country is, like multiply that by, I don't know, Noura, whatever you think the multiplication is. And so it is interesting to see that, okay, Israelis have a limit, but it is also when they feel directly impacted, not necessarily when Palestinians are directly impacted. But I guess I want to move, because, you know, for the first time, and we talked about this the last time you were on, but it, you know, there's been progress here in the United States. You have, you know, the honoring of Nakba Day, the day that, you know, the state of Israel was created in 1948 with Rashida Tlaib, or Representative Tlaib, and that almost didn't happen. That was, you know, I think Kevin McCarthy tried to prevent this commemoration of that date from going forward. And then Bernie Sanders, you know, opened a separate Senate building, so you know, conference room. He found his. I imagine Bernie being like, "Well, no one's checked out this committee room. He's going on the the scheduling. What's the MailChimp version of whatever?" And you know, found them a room, and it was beautiful, and seeing everyone sort of like there. So I guess some of your thoughts on the, you know, and lastly, if not now, has been at AIPAC, you know, trying to bird dog some of the people who were there. So again, progressive Jews in this country who are anti-Zionists, who have very much, I think the Trump administration threw into very sharp view just how far right and authoritarian and racist the Israeli government is. And they don't represent the Jews of the world. And so anyway, Noura, thoughts on progress here in this country?
So many thoughts. So one is just about the fact that I'm, you know, really, I think 2021, the protests in 2021, what they did was consolidate Palestine, I thought, as a progressive issue. And I thought we broke a dam in mainstream news coverage as well. Like I was literally on there, not debating Zionists anymore, but teaching. I was invited, right? What is settler colonialism? Who are the Palestinian citizens of Israel? Why is this not a democracy, but an apartheid and a settler colony, apartheid state and a settler colony? And we also saw Palestinians consolidate their position against Zionism. I think because of the success of that moment, what we've lived since then is basically a counter-revolution, right? Where you have groups like AIPAC and the ADL, you know, insist that now any criticism of Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism, so that you see the White House release reports that say that anti-Semitism is on the rise. And now they have an ambassador on anti-Semitism that needs to combat it, right?
Yeah, but so not from Palestinian and their allies, from your fucking stooges from the right.
You can't make this stuff up, right?
Yeah.
So people who feel like they don't feel safe somewhere, right? That somehow has more cachet than the actual murder of Palestinians and the burning down of entire villages, right? Or this young student, Fatima Muhammad, who just graduated from CUNY Law School, gives a talk that basically echoes everything that we say daily, but gets attacked at the top levels of government, from Senator Ritchie to the Chancellor of CUNY altogether, right? Calling what she said hate speech. So I do think that this all represents weakness. It's a moment of counter-revolution in order to take away these gains. even at the very moment when the Israeli government, for example, has moved the West Bank from, military administration, which gives the veneer of temporariness, right? Military occupation is legal. It's supposed to be temporary. But they moved it under civilian administration, under Bezalel Smotrich. I mean, empirically, Israel is declaring itself an apartheid state, right? It's telling the world, this is who we are. We do not care what you think. And yet here in the United States, they're so committed to this discourse that we're seeing a regression and a backlash. Now, the Nakba Day Memorial was an encapsulation of that. It was supposed to be in the Congressional Visitors Building. The House, Kevin McCarthy, House Speaker, has jurisdiction over that building, canceled it last minute, tried to shut it down in order to celebrate U.S. and Israeli achievements. And instead, we went on with the program in this room, in actually Senator Sanders' committee room. It was his room. And we went on with the program. Got it. And it was amazing. Now, for listeners who don't know the significance of this, think about whether what would happen if across the board, like an Indigenous people declared Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, across the board in the middle of Congress, right? That's what Palestinians are doing. That's what we did. Huge. And in the halls of power that sustain this oppressive condition. And so, as bleak as the situation seems and actually is, and, Blinken's address today at AIPAC was, another form of gaslighting. As bleak as it is, it's also tremendous, the strides that we're continuing to make. And I think that the backlash is an indication of our strength and the opposition's crumbling hegemony.
Yes, absolutely. And like, I just want to, I've had Representative Bowman on this show before, and his, he has a lot of supporters of Israel in his jurisdiction and in his district. And he, for example, I think voted for the Iron Dome funding, and I asked him about it. And I think it's interesting to see then his progression since that time, that, he and Bernie Sanders have sent they sent a letter recently to Secretary Blinken about all the escalating violence. I mean, that's another thing kind of to underscore what you were saying. It's like, a year ago with the bombing in Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, it got massive coverage and it was really, really upsetting to watch. The same thing happened this year. And I didn't see the amount of coverage that I think we saw last year. It was sort of like a normalization of well, I guess that's what happened. And that sort of in tandem with the uprising again inside of Israel, that you're this is people dying, dead, civilians, worshippers.
To the contrary, they use the attacks on Al-Aqsa. I mean, at the deepest level, I think when I watch that, they want to tell us as Palestinians that the natives have no God, right? How easy it is to disgrace us, to disgrace our own divinities, our deities, and to kill us with impunity. That's literally what they're doing in the holiest month for Muslims. Not that all Palestinians are Muslims, but the majority are. But they did that at the same time that they also attacked Gaza in order to deflect attention away from the criticism of the government, right? So that we're also pawns in this domestic dispute. Hey, you can't fight against us because we have this enemy over here. Let's beat up this, let's beat up this defenseless population, right?
Which is usually works.
Israelis. And it works. And it works.
Noura Erakat, you're wonderful, succinct, brilliant, and tireless, but I know you're tired. And thank you so much for being on the show. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or?
The one thing I will add is that, as much as I say this, I do think that, for us, for the Working Families Party, for all parties, actually, we sustain, the United States sustains these conditions. And even if we just abided by U.S. law, the Arms Export Control Act, the Leahy Amendment, which limits U.S. support based on human rights abuses, all we're asking is for the U.S. out of the Middle East, right? Yep. And this is part of a larger project of basically reducing U.S. militarism abroad. It's, it's bases all over the world, but also a militarism that reflects back at home and the entwinement of military and military force in law enforcement. And so these things are very entwined. And I'm very happy to see that, our protests, Palestinian protests against Israel, are actually connected to ending imperialism in the United States as well, and connected to a program of abolition.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/bitchuationroom. Do it.